July 16, 1969, Cape Canaveral, Florida. 500,000 people line the causeways and beaches. The entire world is watching. The Saturn V rocket, 110 meters tall, weighing more than 3,000 tons, begins to tremble. White vapor billows from the base of the launch platform. Then fire. Then a sound that does not so much arrive as physically strike the crowd. More than 34 million newtons of thrust tearing through the morning air. Apollo 11 lifts off the Earth. 4 days later, Neil Armstrong places his boot on the surface of the moon. It is the single most celebrated moment in the history of human science. And standing behind that moment, inside the mission support rooms at Huntsville, Alabama, is a man named Wernher von Braun, the chief architect of the entire Saturn program. Time magazine puts him on their cover. President Kennedy shakes his hand. Walt Disney invites him to appear in a television series about humanity's future in space. NASA medals him. The American press calls him a genius. There is one thing, however, that the journalists do not ask, that the official biographies do not mention, that the school programs leave out entirely. 24 years before that launch, the first rocket Wernher von Braun designed was assembled by 20,000 slave laborers working underground in tunnels without air, without light, and without enough food to survive. More people died building that rocket than were killed by it when it struck London. When the war ended, the United States did not put men like von Braun on trial. They brought them home. They erased the Nazi Party membership from the files, and they handed him an unlimited defense budget to build something new. The program had a name: Operation Paperclip, named after the small metal clip attached to the files of individuals whose records had been made acceptable. Before this story goes any further, consider what the verified numbers actually show, because the scale of what happened is consistently underreported. Operation Paperclip, together with its predecessor and successor programs, brought more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to the United States between 1945 and 1959. Not the 700 figure that circulates informally. 1,600 confirmed individuals, along with their families, who settled permanently in the United States. The U.S. government's own internal assessment valued the intellectual property transferred at $10 billion in 1945 currency, equivalent to well over $150 billion today, measured in patents and industrial processes alone. Among those transferred, rocket specialists, aviation engineers, chemical warfare experts, aerospace medicine researchers, and, in several documented cases, physicians who had conducted lethal experiments on concentration camp prisoners. The conditions President Truman set when he signed the formal program authorization in September 1946 were explicit and unambiguous. No known war criminals, no active Nazi Party members, no individuals whose views were hostile to the United States. Those conditions were systematically ignored. The executing agency was JIOA, the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, a special committee of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. When the State Department or the FBI submitted a security assessment describing a candidate as an ardent Nazi or noting a connection to war crimes, JIOA did not reject the candidate. It rewrote the file. The original dossiers were sealed in classified storage. New versions were created, versions that typically described the subject as having been a nominal party member under duress, or as having had no known political activity. The paperclip did not just mark the person being recruited. It marked the version of that person's history that had been approved for use. March 1945. Allied forces are closing on Germany from two directions: American and British armies driving east from the Rhine, Soviet forces pushing west from the Vistula. Both sides understand with perfect clarity that the country they are conquering contains something more valuable than any physical territory: the accumulated scientific knowledge of the most sophisticated weapons program in human history. At a salt mine in the Harz Mountains of central Germany, tons of technical documents had been hidden. These were the archives of the German Army Research Center at Peenemünde, the facility that had developed the V2, the world's first operational ballistic missile, the weapon that killed more than 7,000 civilians in London and Antwerp. Wernher von Braun, 32 years old, holding a doctorate in physics, a Nazi party member since 1937, and an SS officer holding the rank of Sturmbannführer, equivalent to major, knew the war was lost. He convened his team and asked a straightforward question: to which power should they surrender? The answer that one of his colleagues later recorded for posterity was delivered with the economy of a man who had thought it through. "We despise the French. We are terrified of the Soviets. We don't believe the British have the money to pay us. That only leaves the Americans." On May 2nd, 1945, von Braun and his team descended from the mountain hideout and surrendered to a 23-year-old American private named Friedrich Schneikert. The American side had been preparing for exactly this. From February 1945, SHAEF, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, had deployed a specialist unit known as T-Force, comprising more than 2,000 personnel whose exclusive mission was to locate, secure, and debrief German scientists. They were working from a list, the Osenberg list, discovered by a Polish technician stuffed inside a toilet at the University of Bonn in March 1945, which recorded the names of every German scientist who had been classified as politically reliable and strategically valuable by the Reich. At the top of that list, Wernher von Braun. The Soviet Union was conducting the identical operation from the other side. On October 22, 1946, in a single overnight action, the NKVD executed Operation Oshaviakim, rounding up more than 2,500 German scientists and engineers, along with 6,000 family members, and transporting them east to Soviet research facilities. The operation took one night. Not one of the scientists was asked for consent. The space race did not begin in 1957 when Sputnik reached orbit. It began in 1945. When both superpowers simultaneously descended on the wreckage of the Third Reich to claim its intellectual assets. In November 1945, the program was renamed from Operation Overcast to Operation Paperclip. The reason for the change was simple. The original name had been leaked. Local newspapers in Bavaria had published the location of a holding facility for the scientists. A new, clean name was needed, one with no associations. Now consider the actual individuals, not the sanitized personnel files, but the original records that JIOA chose to seal. Wernher von Braun joined the Nazi Party in 1937, issued membership card number 5,738,692. In 1940, Heinrich Himmler personally dispatched an envoy to Peenemünde to demand that von Braun join the SS. Von Braun agreed, and was commissioned as a second lieutenant. By June 1943, he held the rank of Sturmbannführer, the equivalent of a major. He wore his SS uniform to official meetings, a fact which he would later deny, and which a former Peenemünde SS officer confirmed to the BBC in 2002. The V2 production facility, the Mittelwerk, was carved into gypsum rock beneath the Harz Mountains. The concentration camp beside it was called Mittelbau-Dora. More than 20,000 prisoners died there, from exhaustion, starvation, disease, and hanging when suspected of sabotage. The death toll in the underground tunnels exceeded the death toll of every V2 that struck its targets. Von Braun visited Mittelwerk multiple times. He witnessed the prisoners at work. In January 1945, the entire engineering staff was ordered to attend a public hanging of between 6 and 12 prisoners accused of sabotage. Arthur Rudolph joined the Nazi Party in 1931, 6 years before von Braun. Operations director of Mittelwerk, meaning the man who managed daily slave labor production. He emigrated to the United States through Operation Paperclip, ran the Pershing missile program, and became program director of Saturn V, the rocket that carried Apollo 11. NASA awarded him its highest civilian honor. In March 1984, after the Justice Department's Office of Special Investigations built a war crimes case against him, Rudolph signed an agreement. He would renounce his American citizenship and leave the country permanently in exchange for no prosecution. He died in Hamburg in 1996. Kurt Blome, Deputy Reich Health Leader, Director of a secret biological warfare program codenamed Blitzableiter, Lightning Rod, which operated under the cover of a cancer research institute in occupied Poland. Blome's facility produced plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhoid as weaponized agents. Under Himmler's direct orders, he tested plague vaccines on living prisoners at concentration camps. He coordinated with Japan's Unit 731, the Biological Warfare Unit, exchanging materials and research via submarine. Blome was tried at the Nuremberg doctors' trial in 1947. He was acquitted. Scholars have since argued that the US government intervened to protect him in exchange for his biological warfare data. 2 months after his acquittal, Blome met with representatives from Camp Detrick in Maryland, the US Army's biological warfare facility, to share his methodology. By 1951, his personnel file had been processed by JIOA. The file made no mention of Nuremberg, Hubertus Strughold. Described throughout the post-war era as the father of space medicine, the man whose research underpinned the entire biomedical framework for the American space program. He had served as director of the Hermann Goering Institute for Aviation Medicine from 1935 to 1945. Documentary evidence links him to decompression and freezing experiments on living prisoners at Dachau, experiments in which subjects died during the procedure. NASA named a library at Brooks Air Force Base after him. In 2006, following a campaign by scholars and civil rights organizations, his name was removed from the International Space Hall of Fame in New Mexico. By that point, one generation of young Americans had grown up seeing his name on an honored wall. How did every one of these individuals pass through an American government security clearance process? The answer lies in a mechanism that JIOA constructed, and this is the point at which Operation Paperclip crosses the line from a controversial intelligence program into organized, systematic fraud. The process worked as follows. When the State Department or the FBI submitted a security assessment recommending that a candidate be disqualified, noting active Nazi Party membership, credible connections to war crimes, or evidence that the individual had knowingly administered slave labor, JIOA did not decline the candidate. It rewrote the report. The adverse finding was placed in classified archive storage with restricted access. A replacement document was drafted, typically characterizing the individual as having been a nominal party member under social pressure with no active political record and with no known connection to atrocities. Annie Jacobson, the investigative journalist whose 2014 book remains the most comprehensive account based on declassified records, characterized this process as the most systematic program of document forgery that any American government agency has ever carried out. The State Department fought back. Multiple senior officials, particularly after details of the program leaked to the press in December 1946, demanded that candidates with direct connections to war crimes be excluded. The Army and JIOA dismissed every objection with a single argument, repeated at every level of the chain of command without variation. If we do not take them first, the Soviets will. Jewish organizations in America began protesting the moment information reached the public. The World Jewish Congress raised specific objections by name: von Braun, Rudolph, others, presenting documented evidence that these men had known about and operated within slave labor systems. Those objections were filed under diplomatic considerations and received no formal response. What did President Truman know? The archival record shows he was briefed on the program's existence and signed its formal expansion in September 1946. The evidence that he was fully informed of JIOA's systematic file manipulation is less conclusive. Or, more precisely, the evidence suggests that the people briefing him were careful about what they chose to include in those briefings. Whether Truman did not know the full scope of the forgery, or whether he knew and chose not to ask further questions, is a distinction the available documents do not resolve cleanly. This is the moral and legal core of Operation Paperclip. The question was never simply, was this the right strategic policy? Reasonable people can disagree on that. The question that the evidence forces is different and more damaging. Did a democratic government have the right to systematically deceive its own citizens and its own legal process to implement that policy, without ever submitting it to Congress, without ever making the trade-off public, without ever allowing those citizens whose families had died in the camps to have any say in what was being done in their name? The paperclip was not just an organizational tool. It was a moral alibi, a way of keeping the decisions small, administrative, and deniable. June 20th, 1944, 7:17 in the evening. Peenemünde Army Research Center on the Baltic coast of Germany. A test rocket designated MW18014 lifts off from the launch pad. Its trajectory is vertical. Within minutes, it crosses an altitude of 100 kilometers, the Kármán line, the internationally recognized boundary between Earth's atmosphere and outer space. It is the first man-made object in history to reach space. Wernher von Braun stands in the control room and witnesses the moment. 200 kilometers to the southwest, in the tunnels beneath the Harz Mountains, tens of thousands of prisoners are assembling the next batch of rockets in the dark. This is the central paradox of this entire story. Von Braun was not simply an opportunist or a bureaucratic functionary. He was a genuine visionary, a man who had dreamed of space travel since reading Hermann Oberth's books as a teenager, who had given his entire life to a single idea, that human beings could leave the Earth. Historian Michael Neufeld of the Smithsonian Institution, who spent decades studying von Braun's complete record, described him as a man who consciously participated in a slave labor system, not as a bloodthirsty perpetrator, but as someone who chose not to look when looking might have impeded his work. That is a specific kind of moral failure, not the crime of cruelty, but the crime of convenience. The failure of a man who knew and who persuaded himself that the larger goal justified not asking. And it is precisely the same logic that the United States government used to recruit him. The meeting between von Braun and America was a meeting between two parties who both needed to not ask too many difficult questions. Von Braun needed space. America needed weapons.